Welcome to Ward Goodman WG Hub Live. It's Friday morning, it's 10 o'clock. So ready, hopefully you're ready for another session. Got your cup of coffee here. And we're kicking off with GDPR today. Got a couple of our panelists today. Obviously you've met before. You've got Jono here, our own Jono from Ward Goodman.
Hi guys, all right, morning. Happy Friday.
Jono. And it looks like, well, we've got Mandy, but Mandy's on the phone.
Your mic's muted.
This is I love this. This is live TV, isn't it?
This is live. I'm so sorry. It went just as literally. I was kind of things were all anyway. Sorry.
This is what happens when we get great speakers who are really busy. So welcome, Mandy. Anyway.
Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Morning.
And today's speaker for today is Mark Gracey. Good morning, Mark.
Morning. Thanks for having me along.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for coming on. Mark's an expert in GDPR. He's been supporting businesses with their data protection, compliance since 2016. Used to work for Demon. Now he's a demon of GDPR. Isn't that right, Mark?
Yeah, absolutely.
So obviously Mark's currently offering a lot of support in this area. Things have changed, and as always with these presentations on a Friday morning, there's the angle about the COVID pandemic, and Mark's going to take us through the essentials for GDPR at the moment. There's lots of changes, and so hopefully you'll enjoy this morning's session. Normal rules apply. Please put your Q&A, your questions into the Q&A box if you can. There's a chat function as well. If you want to use that, please feel free. So we'll have our normal presentation and then kick off with the questions and see how we get on. So anyway, welcome everybody, and let's kick off. Mark, do you want to share your slides?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Okay. Hopefully you can see that.
Yeah, that's great.
Great. Okay. So good morning, everybody. My name's Mark Gracey. I run a service supporting businesses with their GDPR compliance. My background in GDPR goes back to the 1998 Data Protection Act when I was working at Demon Internet, as Ian referenced. And for the last 4 years, I've been supporting businesses with their GDPR compliance. I won't say much more than that at this point, but more than happy to have conversations with anybody who would like to understand anything we discussed today, or indeed need specific help. So the purpose of today's session was to look at some of the GDPR implications around coronavirus. I don't need to tell anybody that the sort of the environment and the way we're working is changing almost daily. In some cases, and there are GDPR implications for that. So I'm going to focus on 3 key areas, but happy to take questions at the end in any area relating to GDPR, or indeed this particular area. I think that what I'll do is talk about the 3 areas essentially, which is GDPR and working from home, GDPR and using video conferencing. There's a lot of questions around whether it's okay to use Zoom, for example. And GDPR and your employees returning to work, and if you're testing them for temperature or other checks, or recording information about their coronavirus status, then there's some considerations there. I think what's changing is that we've had this panic period of being told you can't go out unless you need to get food or medical supplies, and a bit of exercise, where it was accepted that we would probably need to adapt quite quickly to the new normal, as it were, as it's often referred to. And I think what's changing now is, as we're coming out of lockdown, that was acceptable to make do. And I'm sure that there's some other areas around health and safety and HR as well, where there's implications of we were having to make do under the circumstances, and there was some there was some sort of grace periods around doing that. And indeed, the Information Commissioner has said that there is, an understanding that businesses are probably having to struggle and pull things together as they go through the crisis. But now, as we're coming out of it, I think it's becoming more pertinent that actually things are changing, and it's now becoming that new normal. Whilst the normal is changing somewhat, that new normal is becoming more normal, if you see what I mean. And there's an element of GDPR and how that fits into actually looking at these things that we're going to cover as being more of a reality now, rather than a getting by doing our best type scenario. So they're probably increasingly becoming important. So I often like to start presentations off with a quick GDPR recap. I'm not going to run through the GDPR because we haven't got the time to do that, but this slide essentially summarizes GDPR. Just to clarify a few things, when we talk about GDPR, GDPR is about the protection of personal data, and that's any data that helps you identify an individual, either directly or indirectly. So if you've got a database where you may be using just a customer ID rather than a name or any other personal identifier, that isn't personal data unless you can convert that customer ID in using another database to a particular person, in which case both pots of data are considered personal data. And personal data is your customers, your suppliers, your employees, and it doesn't matter if you're dealing with B2B, if you're processing, if you're able to identify an employee within a business, their data is personal data, and data protection applies to them, even though they're an employee in a business as opposed to consumer. So this isn't just about consumer data. There's a set of rules called data protection principles. The key ones that people tend to think about is that all processing has to be lawful and fair and open and transparent. And of course, all processing has to be secure. And that is one of probably the key things that of considerations that need to be taken on board when we think about coronavirus and working from home, particularly. There are a set of rules called the lawful basis for processing, which set out why it's lawful for you to do the processing. Most commonly known one is consent. It's not the one that you necessarily always have to rely on, but you might be processing the data because somebody's given you permission, which is consent. It's required as part of a contractual relationship. You're obliged by law, or you have another reason to process the data and it's considered a legitimate interest. And then the data subjects, so the individuals whose personal data is being processed, they have a set of rights. So you've probably heard of the right to be informed, which is why we have privacy policies, the right to access, which is why people get served with subject access requests and so forth. And then finally, probably one of the key things that the GDPR introduced was the accountability principle, the principle that it's not good enough that you think you're compliant, you've got to prove it. And there's various documentary requirements, various tools that you should be using to make sure that you're considering data protection, and the requirement to have policies in place, training your staff, using data protection impact assessments and so forth, as well as things like how to deal with breaches. So I'm not going to go into any more detail than that about data protection, but obviously if anybody's got any questions, we can pick those up at the end. So the new normal, working from home. So businesses some of them are returning to offices, but there's still people working from home. We may know today that there may change the government message. Boris has been saying things like we should be going back to the office if we can, where before it was you should be working from home if we can. But there's still people looking at this either as a long-term solution and having employees working from home long-term regardless of coronavirus, or they are still working from home anyway. Now, this introduces a number of issues. So how are they working from home? Are they using their own devices? Who has access to those devices? How are they securely accessing any work data? What you don't want is a scenario whereby an employee is working from home using a shared computer or a computer, leaving it unlocked, and another member of their household going and using the computer, getting access to the data. They might not do anything from that, but technically speaking, that would be a breach if they got access to any personal data. If they're using their own devices, then that gives the business less control around how they manage that data protection. And so one of the key areas is the security of the processing. How do you, as an employer, ensure that your employees are implementing security at in the same level as you would expect in the office, but at home. And it has to be that strict in the sense that, like I said before, we were kind of muddling along and doing our best. But as things we've had plenty of time to get this right. And as things change and people's businesses are changing, security of company data, personal data is as important when you're working from home as it is in the office. And you need to get that across to your staff. So certainly try and remind your employees about the importance of data protection, whether that's a refresher training if you've not delivered one recently, or some kind of briefing or note. I produced a poster, for example, that can be downloaded from my website that sort of reminds, you can send to employees to remind them of the key things that they need to think about. Document your approach so that you're clear about what you should be doing and what your employees should be doing. But most importantly, you're doing two things. One is you're setting the boundaries for your employees, but also you're making it clear that you understand the circumstances of what working from home means and that you're covering off all the basics. And one of the useful tools to use, and probably one of the most underused parts of GDPR, is a data protection impact assessment, which is essentially a risk-based assessment. So what are the risks from working from home? How do we mitigate those risks? So having a home working policy, a home security policy, or whatever you want to call it, having a suite of policies, a data protection impact assessment where you think about the risks and how you're going to fix those risks, but having a suite of documentation enables you to demonstrate that you've thought all this through carefully. And you should be reviewing this and making sure that the process is working, that people are still aware of the fact about the security issues and what they're doing. If there are technical solutions that you should be putting in place, you should be putting those in place. So if you can introduce a VPN, a virtual private network, which basically creates a encrypted connection to your work servers for the purposes of working from home, then you should be looking at those kind of things from a security point of view and making sure that they're actually being used and worked. And as I said, that last square going around clockwise, we're now looking at this new normal. We don't have the luxury of having an excuse that we're trying to get our heads around exactly what we're supposed to be doing because we've gone from working like normal to suddenly being in lockdown. It's going to be less tolerant. The Information Commission is probably going to become less tolerant. At the moment, they're saying that they're still going to be a bit mindful of it all, but I suspect over the coming months that's going to change, and the expectation is that you're as compliant whether you've got people working from home or not as you would be in the office. So that's a real quick overview, because I know I haven't got too much time to go through stuff about some of the things to think about from a working from home perspective. Of course, if you're working from home and you're we've all seemed to become experts in using Zoom. Obviously other video conferencing services are available. So, things like Teams, GoToWebinar, Skype, WebEx, etc. And what is clear is that we're using these technologies more, and we've probably realized that actually we don't need to travel long distances to go to meetings. We can probably have, do business successfully using video conferencing technology. But there are some issues, and I'm sure we would have seen with the sudden rise in people using Zoom. I'm not quite sure why Zoom was singled out as the most popular at the time, but there was a mad rush in people using Zoom. We were all in our personal life or even in work scenarios. But there are some challenges around that. And there was a big media push at the time highlighting all of the security issues, particularly with Zoom. And Zoom have done a lot to address a lot of that criticism. Some of it, I think, was probably unfounded. But when you look at doing online conferencing, then there's some things you need to think about. The key thing is understanding how you're going to be managing that meeting. So being clear, for example, that as a host, you are a data controller in the sense of GDPR, because you're going to be processing data of people who are joining the meeting. You've got control over who's recording, who has access to the recording afterwards, if that's what you're doing, and so forth. You've got to consider the implications of how the service is being delivered, if it's being delivered through a third-party conferencing platform like Zoom or Skype or Microsoft Teams, then you're going to be using a third-party processor. So are they GDPR compliant in their approach? And that was some of the criticism that Zoom got in the very early days of the lockdown. But you also need to think about your attendees in understanding that actually, if you're recording, you will be recording, depending on what you're showing on screen, you'll be recording them. So if they've got their camera turned on, people will be able to see them while they're participating. But if you're going to be sharing the recording, other people will be able to see them. They'll be able to see their names, depending on whether their names are showing on the video block that appears in the video conferencing. So it's important to, even though it seems obvious, to explain, we're going to be recording this. If you're sat there in your pajamas with people running around in the background of your family members and you've got your video turned on, other people are going to be able to see that. And if that's not appropriate, then you shouldn't have your camera turned on, or you shouldn't be sat there in your pajamas, or you should be putting yourself away in a little cupboard under the stairs or something, so that you haven't got family members running in and out and all those kind of things. Again, a data protection impact assessment is an essential tool here, because you need to think about all of these risks and how you're going to mitigate them. Make sure everybody understands what you're going to be doing. Be very clear that you don't record sessions unless you absolutely need to. I've certainly been involved in a lot that get recorded, and it's not entirely clear why they're being recorded in the first place. And make sure, as I said, that the basics of what video conferencing means is spelled out. And so you should be updating your privacy policy to explain that when we interact through video conferencing, then these are the things that you need to consider, and these are the things that we will do with the data, whether that's you signing up to a particular call or us collecting your data so that we can add you to the list so you get the invite and so forth. So you need to cover off a number of GDPR angles here, but I'd say that the main security risk is really about explaining what you're doing with recordings and the fact that you're identifying people, be able to identify people by the mere fact that they got their cameras turned on. There's a whole load of other considerations, like where you record a session. Is it being recorded on your computer? Is it being recorded in the cloud? If it's been recorded in the cloud, where in the world is it? And there's some questions around processing data, which would be identifiable data if people have got cameras on and the names associated with it, in a non-European Economic Area country as well. So there's quite a few GDPR considerations. I often get, in fact, I've been asked, why are you using Zoom? It's so insecure. But then I think that's the same with any platform. You've got to go with what works best for you, understand the risks, and do something about those risks that are addressing the issues or any of the concerns. And Zoom has done so much recently. You can actually say that you only want the Zoom session to run through servers hosted in Europe or not in China, and all these kind of things. So there's a host of options. A lot of them are user driven. Certainly for Zoom, for example, if you first use Zoom, you get a load of cookie information, and it's important that you read that. So you might want to point that out to users and so forth. And then the final point I wanted to cover was, you're not working from home, you're bringing your employees back to work, but you're needing to think about what you're doing. Are you doing testing? Are you going to be testing employees' temperatures and or other COVID related data for the purposes of protecting your employees, which of course you have an obligation to do under employment law and also from a health and safety point of view as well. So when it comes to COVID testing, you have to think about a number of different GDPR related things. So I would say the first thing, the starting point is, do we need to do this recording? Can we, if we want to do temperature checks and buy a little gadget that you hold to somebody's forehead and it tells you whether they got a temperature or not, you can do that. The real question is, what are you going to do with that information? And if you start writing it down, whether that's on a piece of paper or in a database or adding it to their employment file or whatever you might be doing, you're then processing that data. And the problem is, health related data like a temperature check or an implication of whether they've got a fever or maybe coronavirus positive means you're processing special category of data. And in a GDPR sense, you not only need to have a lawful basis as to why you're storing or processing that health-related data, but you also have to have a special condition which allows you to process it as special category data. So you have to be very clear on your purpose. Why are you doing this? You know, do you need to keep a record? Is there any reason why you should do that? You know, I've spoken to employers who have sort of said, well, from a health and safety point of view, we want an evidence trail to prove that we didn't let somebody in who had a temperature. So we want to say, well, actually, this person came in, but when we measured their temperature, it was this degrees, and therefore not something we were worried about. There is no obligation on employees to do any of this, and it therefore very often comes down to the health and safety question. And if you feel that there is a need to do that recording, then you need to think about these things. But I'd question whether there's absolute need to actually record the temperatures only that you allowed this employee into the office because you had tested their temperature in the first place, but and it seemed okay. You don't need to actually have the temperature itself recorded. You need to communicate what you're doing. So every data subject, so every employee has a right to be informed. So you should have a privacy statement or make it clear to them that what you're going to be doing with that data, how it's going to be used, is it going to be shared with anybody? Will you use it if the NHS test and trace people ring up and say one of your employees has fallen sick? And we need to know who else was there. There's no indication, not like the hospitality industry where there is an indication, but there's no indication in the guidance from the government that the test and trace people would be in touch with you. But as an employer, but you would need to have a mechanism in place to deal with anybody that you might be having to share that information with. Again, data protection impact assessment, use that to demonstrate that you've considered the implications and the risks, and you've worked out the best way of mitigating those risks. And it can be as simple as saying, well, actually, we're not going to have a usual sign-on form so that everybody can see their names and their temperatures and whether they've tested positive recently or whatever it is that you're recording, because that would be a breach of everybody else's special category data, i.e. their health data. So how do you do that? You know, well, it's done through the person in reception, or it's done through this mechanism or whatever. So using a data protection impact assessment, I think there's a common theme here in all three scenarios. Data protection impact assessments are one of the key tools that you have to assess the risks and work out how you're going to fix those risks. And if you're using automated technology, then there are employment rights that the employees should expect about that. There are obligations under GDPR about not using technology in a particular way that could have a bearing on that individual. Probably not quite so much in this area in sense of an automated decision made on that, but there are certain rights relating to employees being monitored. And then finally, as I mentioned before, you need to think about who's going to want access to any data that you are recording if you've got it. And you know, potentially NHS test and trace is an option. You might have to tell people in your business that actually a number of employees have fallen ill. We probably need to lock down the office and leave. You want to minimize giving out too much information about the circumstances, so don't give out names unless it's absolutely necessary. And obviously, if you're shutting down a team and there's one person who normally is in the office but they're not there today, then it's almost pretty obvious that they better work out who it is that might be ill. But basically, minimise the amount of information that you're sharing if you indeed have to. But I would say you need to weigh up your obligations as an employer with the health and safety obligations and your employment law obligations about protecting employees against the necessity of actually recording coronavirus-related information. So that was a whistle-stop view of some of the GDPR challenges relating to coronavirus. If coronavirus itself wasn't enough of a challenge, you've got to think about data protection as well. I'm obviously provide services to help businesses with that. A quick plug, I've got a free webinar coming up in a couple of weeks' time where I'm actually going to look in a bit more detail about what we've discussed, but looking more from that view of saying, well, we've had this grace period of trying to do the best that we can. we're now looking at alternative ways of working in the long term, and what are those considerations, and working in UK businesses with this so-called new normal. But I can give you advice and guidance. There's quite a few free resources on my website if you need them. But my primary offering is a support helpline, offering unlimited email, phone support, hands-on help to help you with that, and so you don't have to worry about the detail, and you can actually go on and do your day job, and I take care of the data protection for you. But if anyone wants to talk to me about that, then feel free to contact me, and my email address is on the bottom of that slide. Send it to hello@markgracey.gdpr.co.uk. So that was all I was going to cover in this session. Did you want to go to Q&A? Shall I stop sharing my screen at this point?
Yep. Thanks very much, Mark. Fantastic. Yeah, no, I really appreciate that. I thought that was a good rounded representation of what's going on at the moment. Was there any sort of, if there was a single point at the moment that you think is the biggest stress point, what do you think that is at the minute?
I think, I mean, it's sort of looking at it from top down. Don't forget GDPR applies. GDPR applies in so many different scenarios, and I think that it's difficult to see sometimes the wood for the trees, because you're worrying about the well-being of your employees, you're worrying about your business, you're worrying about the economy or whatever, and now I'm saying worry about GDPR. So I would say, do bear in mind GDPR. The biggest way that you can make sure things work is ensuring your employees understand their obligations still exist, whether they're working in the office or from home, and use a data protection impact assessment. There's a template on the ICO, the Information Commissioner's website, ico.org.uk, which you can use, that takes you through the way that the thinking pattern you need to go through, but identify the risks and mitigate those risks, and have that as a documentary evidence that you've considered all things. And that essentially that's what you would need to do, is prove that you have not just sent your employees home and told them to get on with working and without any consideration, have the documentation to prove you've thought it all through.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, great. Top-down approach. So let's get the Q&A going. If you've got any questions, please use the Q&A function. We've got a few questions to kick off, but please keep them coming through the next few minutes, and we'll try and get all your questions answered as much as possible.
I've got a quick question for Mark.
You've got a question, John?
Yeah. GDPR originally stemmed, I believe, from Europe, and sort of everybody under European Union adopted it. Now that obviously, well, we're supposed to be leaving the EU come December, January time, what's the implication of GDPR on the UK? Are we still adopting GDPR, or is that changing for us come 2021?
So the good or bad news, depending on which side of the fence you sit, is nothing's changing. We will have UK GDPR, and we'll probably be talking about GDPR, UK GDPR and EU GDPR, which certainly initially, that could be for years, will be the same as European GDPR. But the key implications will actually be, once we have left at the end of the transition period, we would be seen as a third country, so no different than the US or India or China or wherever you may be processing your data, which then brings in a whole host of regulation within GDPR around what's called restricted data transfers, and you have to have appropriate safeguards. Now, funnily enough, this week, I think it was this week or maybe last, the European Commission published published a communication for businesses and member states to think about the implications of a post-transition UK. And there's a data protection section in there, which basically says that they're doing their damnedest to make sure that there's an adequacy decision, but everybody should prepare for the basis of there not being an adequacy decision. An adequacy decision basically is the EU saying, yes, the UK has equivalent data protection law. Now, a lot of people say, well, why wouldn't they say that? Because we've been part of Europe, and the last 2 years GDPR has applied, but actually it's a bit more complicated than that. There's some other bits of legislation in the data arena that we use that the EU aren't happy that we've implemented, and they could potentially question that from that regard, we've not got an adequacy decision, or they might just run out of time because there's a lot of different Brexit related issues. So that was a very long way of saying, yes, we will still have EU GDPR. It'd just be probably called UK GDPR. But there are some challenges, particularly if you are in the UK and you get sent data from the EU, they will be seen as restricted transfers. And if you're a UK business targeting EU citizens, you will probably need to have somebody in Europe representing you for data protection issues if you don't have an office over there. There's a lot more to it, and I didn't put it up, but I've got a webinar coming up on that as well to go through what the implications are of what we know right now. The key will be the next 5-6 months as the transition stuff gets worked out. But from January the 1st, 2021, we will no longer be part of Europe, and therefore whatever is decided will be applicable from a GDPR point of view as well.
Mm. Well, it seems to be that we want to test this country as much as possible. With all the different challenges, don't we? So yeah, I'd like to bring in Mandy at the minute. Mandy, how are you? What are you seeing out there? I guess from a Purple HR perspective, what's your general feelings about this area? Obviously, you work with Mark quite a lot. I understand. I mean, in terms of you have an ongoing relationship on GDPR in terms of employment.
Yeah, I think the key thing is two key things really. One is temperature checking, which is prevalent, and lots and lots of businesses are doing that. We've got lots of clients that have got the temperature gun at the door, and as people come on to shift, what is the right way to go about that? And I think it's interesting what Mark was saying. Consent, that's right down the end of the pile really in terms of legitimacy from a GDPR perspective. And so it's thinking about what is your legitimate reason. I think it comes probably a lot back to the health and safety side, to be honest with you, duty of care to keep the workplace safe. I think there's a question mark around, there is a tendency that once we get a bit of data, once we've recorded your temperature, I want to keep it forever kind of thing. And of course, what's the Mark asks, what I call it is those daft questions really. Why do you need it so long? Well, why do you need it so long? Even if you think from a self-isolating point of view, if you take it today, if nothing's happened in, let's say, 2 weeks' time, well, then what is the use of having that temperature that you took a month ago? So I think it's really prompting us to think about that, because we keep things for keeping things sake. And I've been in HR many years now, and I'm still one of the old-fashioned ones. I like a personnel file, and I like everything in there, so I can go and refer to it. But I think you've got to think about that kind of stuff. So I think that's a question mark for everybody. I think this, and it's funny, that call that you caught me on, literally just as I came on to join you this morning, was somebody asking me about DSE assessments. So we've got people working from home. Obviously, we all started off with go home, go home, go home. Here's a laptop, here's a phone. Just carry on, but go home and do it. Yeah. And now lots of conversations I've had over the last week is around about, okay, so actually, where are you working at home? So I've got someone that's sitting on the edge of their sofa with their laptop propped on their knee. So there's various issues in there. Here's a health and safety perspective, because next thing we're going to have backaches and posture problems, and the kids have tripped over the leads. Oh, there's kids running around, is there? Well, what risk assessment have we done? So the question that the lady asked me before I came and joined you this morning was, well, they've only been doing it I don't have to do a DSE if they're only working from home for a short period of time, do I? Yes, you do. And in some ways, it's kind of more needed because of that emergency situation. You haven't really thought about that. Whereas someone put a home working request into you, you've talked about it, you've discussed it, you've done an assessment, you've planned it. Nothing's been planned. But that emergency side is really fading now. You should really be looking at what you're doing, and if that's going to be a more formal situation. And lots of businesses are, this is kind of working for us now. I think we'll carry on. So, the excuse of not looking and doing your due diligence, if you like, for people working at home is, I think that argument would now be very, very weak if we haven't, we're not undertaking those things. So I think and that's what we're certainly seeing. A lot of the whole DSE side, certainly, when you start to ask those questions, because one of the things we would normally do sometimes is maybe do a home visit, see what the working environment is, and that's perfectly legitimate to do in previous situations and part of your policies often, but that's not so easy to do now. So it's maybe videos that you're using to get the employee to agree that we need to make sure, you need to satisfy yourself that you've got these they've got the environment set up. Maybe not that you necessarily record it, but you have a tour around, you know, the working environment, just to see what the environment is, who's living in the household, who's sharing. You know, it could be another member of their family, their partner, who's also sharing the same dining room table, laptop one end, you know, bookend laptops, both working. And then you've got to think about the whole GDPR side, how, you know, what papers are around. There certainly are things to consider, but I've got a question for Mark, if I may, which has come up a few times recently. Our friends Alexa, and she might talk to me now, or Hey Google, so our gadgets that we have in our homes, you know, we're being told that, you know, Big Brother's listening to us subtly all the time, and we only have to say, you know, an odd word, and it will pipe up and say, I can't do that for you, when you're not even talking to the things. What's the impact around GDPR and these devices and people working at home? That's a question that's come up quite a lot just more recently.
That's a brilliant question. It's the same. So I think there's a lot of uncertainty around how these applications are working. Are they listening passively, waiting to hear the Hey Google or the Alexa prompt, or are they listening all of the time and recording that? So certainly the way that they work will be they will allegedly they record stuff so that they can improve the service, and they've had. There was some sort of almost sort of mini scandals about 6 months ago around employees listening in on things and sharing recordings with the wrong people and stuff like that. And you know, there is a real privacy issue around that. So from a just having one in your home, there's some privacy implications that you should understand. And, you know, that the providers do set those out so that you can understand that, you know, if you want to use this device, you do need to understand that this is happening. Now, in a working environment, it depends what you're doing. You know, if you're busy typing away on a computer all the time, then fine. But if they are in a room where you're having a one-to-one conversation with somebody over the phone or on a video conference, then yes, there's a potential, if that service is doing what most of them are implied that they're doing, which is that they are listening of some type, then potentially Amazon, Google, Apple, or whatever you're using, is somewhere recording the conversation or processing it. So if you're talking about personal data, then there's a possibility that that would be considered a breach technically. From a GDPR angle, I've not seen any questions or any guidance or any commentary on that. The simple answer is don't have them turned on while you're having those conversations, or take them out of the room that you're working in. So, you know, going back to what you were saying, we've had this, and also the point of what I was saying is we've had this period of panic and doing our best. Now we need to think about it properly, and these kind of things will come up, and we need to think about those properly. And if you're in the lounge and that's your only working place, that's probably not appropriate from a business point of view anyway. It's not going to give you the best posture if you're laying on the lounge. It's certainly not going to help if another member of the family is watching telly at the same time, all these kind of things. And turn your Alexa off, but that might not work if somebody's using the Alexa for a good reason. So go into a room where you haven't got one. So back under the stairs again, I reckon.
Obviously, we've we try and kit out our staff with we've been trying to anyway with the headphone kit. I mean, there's Jono with his headphones on. I know he's a professional at this anyway, so he's got his own gear. And there's another question about using your own gear. But would you encourage the use of the headphones and the microphone sort of situation then?
Well, you do it. You would. So if there is a device recording or other people around hearing you talk, they're obviously going to hear only one side of the story. But if your side of the story that they can hear involves personal data, then you're still having to consider the GDPR issues, regardless of wearing headphones. I think it will. It will give less context if you can only hear one side of the story, but it really depends on what's being discussed.
It's an interesting one. I think we'll see how that pans out over kind of coming months ahead, but it's certainly something that's starting to be talked about.
So we may be up for all change today, then guys, because of the discussion about the emphasis on should you be encouraging everybody to be at home if they can, to being back in the office if you can. Is that right?
That's what I've heard in the news, and I don't know what Mandy thinks about this, but I'm certainly talking to a lot more businesses who are thinking, actually, we can probably do this long term, regardless of whether we need to, either because they feel that that's the safest way to proceed whilst there isn't a vaccine and the virus is still in circulation. But actually, even if there isn't a virus in circulation, we've proven that we can survive, and our employees do actually work properly when they work from home, and we're cutting down on travel costs, we're cutting down on time being lost to travel and all these kind of things. So I think a lot of businesses are looking at this as a more of a longer term thing, whether that's the next 6 months to see how things go with coronavirus, because now we're all being told that there could be a second spike for sure in the winter, and that's going to be confused by people catching flu and all these other things that are issues as well. But actually longer term, as an option for employees. And I mean, quite early on, I think it was Twitter or Google, somebody quite well known globally was quite early on in the lockdown saying, actually, this is working. We're going to let our employees work from home all the time if that's what they want to do. So that will become even more important to meet all the things that Mandy said from an HR point of view, and all the things that I said from a GDPR consideration as well.
I think there's a mix, to be honest with you. I think what we're hearing is businesses are kind of like the ability to have a bit of a blend. So maybe a couple of days working from home, a couple of days in the office, and doing some rotation. Because I think one of the things that also we have to be mindful of is that whilst the Zoom world, our virtual world, is great, and we can see everybody and say hi and do all this kind of stuff, it's not the same as social interaction. Part of coming to work is to kind of have a chat and have a coffee with somebody and, pass the time of day and have that, not necessarily physical contact, but, you're in the same room, you're in the place and in the space kind of thing. So I think there are some people who are struggling with mental health issues right now who, the working from home, I've got my intermittent Zoom or Teams calls, but apart from that, then I'm on my own. And that can be very lonely, very isolating, and difficult maybe to motivate yourself to get stuff done, and can drift. So I think what we like to see, I certainly think we're going to see more of it. I think the conversations with employers are going to be more difficult when someone asks now to be a home worker. The way that it might normally trip off the tongue, no, you have to be in the office. It's not such a, that's going to be more of a challenge for employers to keep, just to say no all of a sudden, because actually it's been working fine for 4 months now, because it had to. Why so different now? So I think what employers have got to do, and we've encouraged it for years anyway, and said, before you just say no, just why not? Why wouldn't it work? If nothing else, give it a go, give it a try. But maybe there is a blend in there as well that you can think of. And so I think, like everything in life, it's about a balance, isn't it? So I think it's good that there's more of it. I don't think it's the be all and end all, though. I do think there is a need for people, because as human beings, we like to be around other human beings, and that's a bit different than being just on the screens.
Yeah. But you've then got the challenge, though, with the blended situation, is perhaps some transfer of data, some information, some files.
Yeah, but then
how do you take all those?
Yeah, well, it brings those other challenges, doesn't it? What we have to do short term. That's just, Boris says, go home, lock the doors, go home. We did as we were told, and we went and locked ourselves away. But now we are, as Mark is saying, we're now in, this kind of moving into this new normal. It's not such an emergency anymore. So hang on, we've got to think about all of this stuff for now. And whilst let's all work from home, actually there are some other implications in there that we do actually have to think about, whether that's GDPR, whether that's health and safety, if people's working environments. People's homes are just not set up to work, to be a workplace. And I don't want them to be a workplace. I've got a couple of employees that I don't want to work from home. I don't have a setup. I don't have an office. I don't want to do that. All this paraphernalia of printers and cables and stuff like that. It's quite an invasion into your home life if that's not what you want. So those issues are starting to come up as well, actually. And I don't think we should underestimate some of those. But yeah, I think the realities of what that home working actually means, and also additional cost perspectively, because it's an extension of your workplace. Therefore, you're responsible to make sure that they've got all this kit at home.
Yeah, and offices are set up for systems. I mean, this is what we're, I think Mark alluded to the fact that you've got a system for doing this, and this is where you store it, and this is and come to recognise that that's acceptable. It's been checked, it's been viewed, and all that sort of thing. Yeah. And then you're tearing that system apart. I was speaking to the director of quite a large company around here, and he said it's just impossible for him to work at home because of that. That he just hasn't got the access to what he wants immediately and in the right place. And I think that's just where it's starting to fall down. It's
I do as well. Yeah, I do as well. Short term, I think it's fine. We've all coped really, really well. We just kind of, as use Mark's phrase, we've just got on with it. We just fixed it. But that's all landing now, and there's some of those practicalities. And I'm not sure that quite works. You need other stuff and access just to things like printers or scanners and that kind of stuff. All of a sudden you're recreating a work environment at home. When everybody's home, all needs those setups potentially. So because quite serious cost implications and all of that.
I've got a box. Oh, is it just me? Has got a box at home with the papers in it that you've got, your backwards and
just think about what you said there, a box with all those papers in it.
Yeah, and it's just, that's, and that could be sort of fairly harmless stuff, but you've really got to look after it when it's,
you may feel it's harmless, but if you're the person whose data is on all those paperwork, would I feel that was harmless, that I'm sat in a box in your lounge, potentially?
Yeah, that's right. No, that's exactly
so
that.
I think there's all of those kind of things to come into play. So, but equally, we've also got to remember that we've got a function here. So there's an element, a big dollop of practicality amongst all of this, without taking really unnecessary risks and piling up your costs. So I think there's huge cost implications that have to be taken into consideration as well. So So I think it's an interesting time that we're going into right now, where the whole home working debate is about. In theory, it all just sounds very simple and straightforward, but I think there's a lot more to it to think about than maybe we think.
Yeah, there's a couple of things, if I could just add in there. That one is, if you make the systems too complicated or they don't work properly, like if you're working from home, most people have their own personal accounts and things. So I've come across organisations who have VPN set up and stuff like that, but when you want to print to your home computer, it doesn't quite work properly. So they email themselves the data to their Gmail account, which is a personal account which doesn't got the data protections in place, and then then they've left it in their Gmail, or they've downloaded it onto their computer. There's a whole raft of things to consider from a IT security perspective. And on on the other thing, and I haven't said any of this about some of a risk of sounding a slightly scaremongery about it, is the implications of getting it wrong and what that could mean in the long term from an ICO investigation leading to a fine or whatever. And often people say to me, well, I talk to them about security of data, the example and the kind of thought process you have to go through, which is why a data protection impact assessment is so useful, is sort of exemplified in a real case scenario. A care worker took some work home with her to work from home overnight on a computer which wasn't secured. She left it in her, in a handbag or a bag in the hallway, went to bed, her house was burgled, the bag and the computer got stolen, and the company who she worked for got fined, I think it was £40,000. This was under old data protection law. Because they hadn't instilled in the employee the importance of securing that. So, when you think about what you've got to do, I jokingly say, if only she put the computer under a pillow when she was asleep or under a bed, because people are, burglars are less likely to break into the room where you're sleeping in case they disturb you. But nobody expects to be burgled either. So, why was it not reasonable for her to leave it in there? But that just proves as a case that actually you've got to think outside of the compliance box as much to consider all of the potential ramifications and implications. And You know, if that scenario leads to a fine, then you can see this scenario of, well, somebody's Gmail account got hacked and it had a load of work stuff in it because they'd emailed themselves to get round, can lead to the company getting into trouble because they've not got that control over their employee when they're outside the office environment.
Yeah.
Easy done, that one. I can see that happens a lot, actually, particularly if you want to get something printed.
Yeah,
it's all been there.
Absolutely.
So we have actually got a sort of a systemsy type question come through actually. During COVID-19, data solutions and offerings from different organizations showcase the benefits of cloud-based data offerings. Fair enough. Data is held outside an organization and outside its direct control, i.e. the third party. How do we feel about that? I mean, you actually sort of mentioned that where data, is it okay just to say, well, that's a known sort of software or system? Can we just accept data is?
No, because of the accountability principle, you've got to prove that it's okay to use that third party. So GDPR has the concept of processing, and it has a really wide definition. So it's not just that what you've got the data for. So if we talk about temperature checks, so I've got the temperature check data so that I can provide evidence that we didn't let an employee in with a high temperature or whatever. The wider definition of processing actually is the storing, the sharing, the editing, the deleting, the manipulating, and everything. So anything you do with that piece of data is considered processing, which means that if you use a cloud-based piece of software to store your data, whether that's your CRM, your customer relationship management, if you're using something like HubSpot, or if you're storing contact details in Xero for accounting purposes or whatever, they are a processor, not in the sense you said, here's my data, do something with it, in the fact that they provide an application which is maintained by them so that you can do something with your data. And the GDPR says if you use a third-party data processor, you have to be sure that they are GDPR compliant, and you have to make sure there's a contract between you and the third-party processor to be clear that they are bound by specific contract terms which are set out in the GDPR in Article 28. It actually lists what needs to be in the contract. And what that means is that you're binding both organizations to applying appropriate GDPR controls and giving that control to the owner of the data, as it were. So if you use a cloud-based service, yes, but the accountability principle means you've got to demonstrate you carried out that due diligence to make sure that they're compliant, and that you have a contract in place, which is usually called a data processing agreement.
Yeah.
Now, there's an added confusion here, an added thing that's happened yesterday that throws a lot of the answers to this question into question, because yesterday a court case found that the EU-US Privacy Shield agreement, which is when you process data outside of the EU and in the US, is not valid. So if the cloud-based service provider is a US-based company that only has servers in the US, so if you're using MailChimp or even Zoom, for example, is a US-based business, and they're relying on Privacy Shield to demonstrate that they are understanding of the GDPR implications, you can no longer rely on that as a valid way of showing that. And the reason that Privacy Shield has been deemed invalid is because the US national security laws require certain businesses to hand over data. So Facebook and for all these kind of things are the ones that we tend to hear about. And the alternative to using Privacy Shield is to use standard contract clauses, which are non-negotiable contract clauses provided by the EU, which you again put in place between the controller and the processor. But if your processor is in the US and they say, well, you can't use Privacy Shield because of the national security laws, you can't use standard contract clauses either, because for the same reason, those contract clauses can't be abided by if the company in the US is bound to hand over data to the government if required. Mm. So taking this back to the question, the problem is your third-party processor, your cloud-based system that maybe you're using for sharing, storing your data, enabling the functionality of your business to provide a central place for employees to get access to data and systems, for example, may be being processed in the US. And now, because of this decision that was made yesterday in a European court, it brings into question whether that's going to be allowed or not. I think that, that's probably a bit too scaremongery view on it, because I think things are working out and you don't have to suddenly stop using them right now. But, the EU are saying that they're trying to work out a most appropriate approach. The companies themselves, I had an email this morning from a provider that I use saying, you will have seen this, don't worry, we are going to, we will have the option for you to say, I want my data stored in the EU. And, so there's going to be a change in the way it is. So it's not the end of the world as we know it, as it were, but, there's some challenges, but that also indicates the kind of checks and balances you have to put in place if you are going to be using these cloud providers.
Okay. All right, Mark. You got any points on that, Jono, in terms of processing?
So I'll speak with an example, really, because a lot of our clients that use cloud-based software use Xero as like a financial function. Xero aren't based in the UK predominantly. They're based in New Zealand, Australia, but they have their own GDPR sort of documentation on their website. It's quite easy to access, and it tells you all the criteria that they've done, everything they've done to go through and comply with GDPR. And they actually have, Mark, you alluded to it, DPAs anyway. So they have their own sort of documentation that you sign up for between each other when you subscribe to them. They also have a number of sort of to service the second part of the question in terms of cloud software, sales ledger, cash flow forecasting, and the potentials, and relating that to GDPR Xero in particular, as well as QuickBooks, etc. They'll have bolt-ons or extensions such as Stripe or Tide, which will allow you as a user of Xero to take card payments or transactions through it, which Xero sort of arguably have a duty of care to ensure that they are GDPR compliant. And Stripe is one of the software extensions which is GDPR compliant. So I'd say, to answer that question, Xero offer extensions, but they have sort of a vetting process to ensure that they're legal, etc., because they don't want to be held account for any sort of legalities around it anyway. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
No. I mean, it's getting a very complex world with applications, and not just the base softwares now. There's applications joining on applications. We deal with all these additional applications that go into the base software as well. And so that'd be interesting to see. I suppose it's watch this space now, Mark. Then for the result of that.
The Privacy Shield replaced Safe Harbor, which was deemed invalid in 2015, and there was a sort of grace period in which organisations got to adapt to an alternative way. So I suspect that something like this will happen. But the Information Commissioner issued a statement saying that they're considering the implications, but that's about it. And the European Union have said that they're already working on potential ways to address the issues that have been raised. So it is watch this space, and what time frame though is difficult to say.
Okay, well, thanks very much for that. Do you want any more to add, Mandy? We're just reaching the end of the session now. So, any points?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think it's been a really good, conversation. Actually, I joined one of Mark's webinars the other day. Actually, he invited me along as a guest, and it was kind of stuff you don't really think about. Maybe I think in the fullness of, but we do need to. I think it's really important that we do start now to be thinking about this stuff a little bit more carefully, and get some audit trails. With my HR naggy hat on, as I do now and again, good records, guys, keep, write it down, things like risk assessments and stuff, you do need your audit trail in place. So if you're going to be able to, defend your position if you're called into question for some reason, if there's, you might have talked about it, but if you've got no evidence, then it's like it never happened. So, do yourselves a favour, a little bit of work now, and it doesn't need to be over the top, but get some things documented, will serve you in good stead. Hopefully you'll never need to use them, but I think they're sensible insurance policies when and part of your responsibility is running an efficient business.
Yeah. Okay. And do you want your final plug of your next event, Mark? Do you want to?
Yes, so I've sort of pulled together a number of different things coming up. Probably the best place is go to my website, markgracey.gdpr.co.uk. Have a look in the training and events section. But I've got a webinar about the new normal, which I mentioned before. A webinar about the Brexit changes, and also I will have a webinar in a couple of weeks to look at what we know about these changes to the Privacy Shield and the processing of data in the US.
Okay. No, thank you. And you're going to share obviously you're going to share these slides, aren't you, to our WG Hub?
Yep.
And put some useful info on there. So thank you very much, Mark.
Yeah,
today.
well, thanks for having me along.
Being our speaker. Thanks, Jono, for joining us today.
Cheers. Thanks, guys. Happy Friday.
And Mandy, as always.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Okay.
So,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So next week we're drawing to a close the COVID-19 series of WG Hub Live. We're going to move into other subjects in September. But next week it's a personal finance special run by Ward Goodman, along with we've got our speaker as well is from Ward Goodman Financial Services, Adrian Seeger, and we're talking about later life planning, but also raising cash, and it should be a great end to this series. So please join us next week, Friday, 10 o'clock, and see you then. Thanks for joining us today.